Next guest, she is the head of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And we're going to hear all about the 2020 census and the fact that they have filed suit along with a number of other civil rights organizations. Kristen Clarke joins us now. Kristen, good morning. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure to have you. Tell us about the suit that you filed, if you would, please.
Yes, last week we filed suit against this administration over its 11th hour decision to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. In our view at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, this is a clear attempt to hijack the upcoming census, and there is so much at stake for our communities, for communities of color in particular. Every 10 years, our nation embarks on a journey of undertaking a very complicated task, capturing an accurate count of the population. And the goal is not capturing the number of adults or number of voters or number of citizens. It's just about capturing the number of people from community to community across the country. And that census data is used for a number of things. But most importantly, it's used to disperse $600 billion in federal funding. Mm-hmm. And it's also used for redistricting. It's data that's used for redistricting of the House of Representatives in Congress. And then states and localities use that to redistrict everything from state legislatures to city councils and so forth. It's important that we know where people live. And it's important that that census produce an accurate snapshot of how many people we have, community by community in the country. And this citizenship question was added for one reason and one reason only. It's intended to have a chilling effect on communities of color, on immigrant communities, on people who fear interaction with the government and who may fear that disclosing their citizenship status could lead to unfavorable consequences. We haven't seen a citizenship question on the census form since 1950. So once again, we see this administration resorting to Jim Crow era tactics that are all designed and aimed at locking out minority communities and communities of color. And so that's why we filed this suit, and that's why we're fighting back. We want a fair census that allows everyone to participate and be counted.
It is the feeling that if there is a citizenship question there, that will discourage some from actually participating in and filling out the census.
Absolutely, and study after study has confirmed that that citizenship question will have a chilling effect, that people will not complete the form, will not turn the form in, will fear that disclosing, that checking that box says, I'm not a citizen, will have some negative consequences. And what's especially troubling about this 11th hour decision is that, one, this hasn't been done since 1950, but we also know that the reality is that African American communities, Latino communities are the communities that tend to experience the highest undercount decade to decade. This government should be working on taking steps that can close that gap and not taking steps to exacerbate what has been a historical undercounting of minority communities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that makes it even more risky, doesn't it? Because what you have, there's undercounting, unfortunately, isn't there, Kristen, even when you don't have citizenship on the census, correct?
Take citizenship out of it, and unfortunately, we have seen an undercount.
Yeah.
In 2010, about 2.1% of African Americans were not counted, and that has dire consequences for majority Black communities, for African Americans in general. That means loss of federal funding for things like schools and hospitals. Medicare and Medicaid, highway construction and veterans assistance and transportation programs. $600 billion in federal funding is at stake. And if we don't capture an accurate count of the population, communities lose out, we lose out.
Yeah, yeah. It in terms of that losing out, Kristen Clarke with us, folks. Your questions on the census and the citizenship question on the census. We'll take your calls quickly. 866-99-SIRIUS, 866-997-4748 with Kristen Clarke here with us 19 minutes before the hour. The in terms of losing out on those resources, give people an idea of what those resources are and what they mean, because a lot of people take that for granted. Quite frankly, I don't think all of us even knows what the census is and how resources are allocated, but it tells us a number of people in a particular community and what ultimately, because of that number, how responses to needs in terms of resources are allocated, correct?
That's right. And just to take a step back, the Constitution requires that every 10 years we capture a count of all people in each state, regardless of citizenship status. That's literally the language from the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And that enumeration of people is called the census, and it's taken every 10 years. In April of the start of a decade is when census forms go out. Census takers are visiting homes, and they're capturing a count of the population. And this has been done for decades, and without that census data, our government really couldn't function or operate. There really wouldn't be a fair metric that we could rely on to determine how we distribute federal funding. And that funding supports things like education, Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP programs, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program for kids, state's Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, highway planning and construction, veterans assistance, transportation programs, hospital construction. All of these critical infrastructure needs in communities would not receive proper federal funding if we didn't have census data to work with. But the reality is that communities of color have historically lost out because we tend to be undercounted. We have a lot of work to do in the lead up to Census Day to make sure that communities of color understand why the government is knocking on their door and capturing this data. And, you know, my organization and many organizations start this work now. Start this work of, you know, working with churches and community groups so that they understand that the census is important, that it's important to be counted. And so for the administration to make an 11th hour decision like this really hijacks all of the hard work and effort that goes into educating communities now about why they should participate. And that's why we're not standing back and waiting to see how this plays out. We know that this will have a devastating impact on the 2020 census. We want that citizenship question off. It serves no purpose. It will have a chilling effect on minority communities, and there's just too much at stake to let that happen. So that's why we're going to court to fight.
And particularly, this was done in San Jose because that was where one of the most egregious undercounts occurred, correct?
Right. So my organization, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, represents two entities in this lawsuit that we filed. We represent the city of San Jose, which is a very diverse municipality in California. When you look at the top 20 metro areas nationwide with an undocumented population, San Jose is often on that list. And we know that undocumented communities tend to have really high rates of an undercount. So a lot's at stake for the city of San Jose. There are about 40% of the population are immigrants. In the last census, there was an undercount of about 70,000 people, and that translated into a loss of $20 million in federal funding. So there's a lot at stake for San Jose. We also represent BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which is an organization represented by Opal Tometi, and they represent the unique interests of the undocumented population from African and Caribbean nations. They're an organization that does a lot of work to make sure that those communities understand why the census is important. And now they have to divert their resources to overcome the obstacles created by this administration's really reckless decision to add this unnecessary question on the census. When you think about it, an undocumented person from the Caribbean or from West Africa, gets this question and sees this question on a form and then says, well, let me take a step back and think about what's been happening in our country. We've had a travel ban on people coming into the country from predominantly Muslim nations. We have a president who has made disparaging comments about people from African and Caribbean countries. We've had ICE raids on communities of color. When you think about the context in which this administration has made this decision, there is no reason to expect that an undocumented person would be comfortable checking that box and sending it into the government. And so those are the interests, and that's who we're fighting for in this case. At the end of the day, if we're successful and we prevail, we think that we'll end up in a place where we have a truer picture of the population in the country and reliable data that we can work with to make critical decisions about federal funding and about how we reapportion districts across the country.
No, that's very, very important. Kristen Clarke with us. Do you think your chances are good in court and that you might prevail?
When you think about the fact that this hasn't been done since 1950, I think we have reason to be hopeful. Let me also share this. The reason they claim they needed to add this citizenship question to the census form is because the Justice Department says it's needed to help with enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. That is a laughable justification. Under Attorney General Jeff Sessions, this Justice Department hasn't filed a single Voting Rights Act case on behalf of minority communities. If anything, they have turned the clock back when it comes to work to protect the rights of minority voters. So the idea that they would hijack the way that we conduct our census nationwide because of a spurious claim that from the Justice Department that this is needed to help with enforcement of the Voting Rights Act is just unbelievable. We think that when we go into court, we'll be able to show that their justification falls flat, and we believe we have significant evidence and data that shows that the citizenship question will have a chilling effect and harm our ability to capture an accurate count of the population in 2020. That's obviously very, very important. Kristen Clarke with us. We will. So it's you filed suit. What's next in terms of what we are going to be hearing back from court in terms of the process? Well, we filed in California in federal court, the Northern District of California. The California State Attorney General's Office and the New York State Attorney General's Office have filed cases as well. Former Attorney General Eric Holder is in the fight as well.
Okay.
We think that it's really important that the interests of communities on the ground be heard. We, as a nonpartisan civil rights organization, are in this fight because we want to make sure that we speak truth to power about how this will impact Black and brown communities across the country and how this will impair their confidence and ability to freely participate in the 2020 census. We want a fair 2020 census count, and we want to encourage communities across the country to participate and raise their hand and be counted at the end of the day.
Kristen Clarke of the Lawyers Committee of Civil Rights under Law. Folks, I'd be remiss, too, if we didn't ask Kristen about another issue she's been tweeting. First of all, Kristen is a great tweeter, and her tweets are always very informative. I encourage people to follow her, Kristen Clarke with an EJD on Twitter. Kristen, what's your take on this Starbucks situation?
Well, retail racism is alive and well across the country, and we know that Starbucks has a lot of work to do to make sure that its workforce treats consumers fairly on the basis of race. I'm encouraged to see that they're taking a baby step by closing their stores for a day and holding implicit bias training for its workforce, but that's not enough. We need to make sure that retailers like Starbucks are working every day to have a zero-tolerance approach to racism and discrimination. And when employees run afoul of those laws and policies, they should be purged. They should be removed. I think about these two African-American men who were impacted here. 2 minutes they're inside Starbucks, and they call the police on them. And, I think that they've been incredibly dignified. They want to see this used as a teaching moment to highlight the racism that African Americans like them experience day to day. But implicit bias training is just not enough. To me, this was a textbook example of just outright racism, a textbook example of the double treatment and double standards that African American consumers face every day. And when you've got, multi-billion-dollar companies like Starbucks not doing enough to make sure that their workforce has a zero-tolerance approach to discrimination, to me, that makes clear that we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And what about, too, I mean, we know about the shooting at one Waffle House, but there's the other police assault against the young lady in the Waffle House in Saraland, Alabama. Have you seen that? Have you had a chance to see that video, too?
I have. The video is really disturbing. It was disturbing to see this woman taken down to the floor. Her clothes came down off of her chest.
Right.
It's unclear why they're using force on this African-American woman. And at the same time that we're looking at this image, we see the image of Mr. Reinking, who was caught with ammunition and caught with, a semi-assault weapon, brought in handcuffed. Apparently officers demonstrated proper restraint and felt no need to use deadly force in that instance. Too often, African Americans are subject to unnecessary use of force by law enforcement, and we have a lot of work to do to confront what is truly a national crisis.
Chakesia Clemens, and if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and I'll be very honest with you, Kristen, that as the more I look at that video, I mean, obviously, as you said, her clothes came off, her breasts were exposed. And if you look closely, even when she's seated before they tackle her to the ground for no reason, those officers managed to put their hands on practically every part of her body. And I encourage people to look at that again, and that just stands out to me. And she's already undressed, practically.
Yeah.
So, 3 white officers, they touch her legs, her arms, her chest, her neck, her back, her buttocks. They are all over her body. And it's just too much. It's just completely too much. So we're gonna watch that as closely as we can. Also, I'm afraid we're out of time. Kristen, we need to talk more, and we want to be as supportive as we can of your work in the Lawyers Committee. Folks, go to the website, of course, lawyerscommittee.org. Follow Kristen on LawyersCom, 2 M's on Twitter. And then Kristen's also on Twitter, Kristen Clarke with an E, JD. Kristen, love you. Keep up the great work and keep us posted about the suit, okay?
Will do. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, bless your heart. Folks, of all minds are clear, it has been made plain.